It's November 8th, 1983. A flash telegram arrives at KGB stations across Western Europe. The message is urgent. NATO forces have been placed on high alert. A nuclear strike might be imminent. In East Germany, Soviet pilots are running to their aircraft. They're loading live nuclear bombs onto a dozen Su-24 Fencers and MiG-23s. The crews have 30 minutes to be airborne. Across Poland in the western USSR, 70 SS-20 ballistic missiles move to full readiness. Their warheads are aimed at NATO bases across Europe. Under the Arctic ice, Soviet submarines slip into hiding positions. In Moscow, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov has the nuclear command codes at the ready. General Secretary Yuri Andropov, despite his failing health, has the nuclear briefcase brought to him, the device that could authorize the end of the world. The Soviets believe they're witnessing the opening moves of a surprise NATO nuclear attack. They're preparing to strike first. But 1,000 miles away in Brussels, NATO commanders are drinking coffee and reviewing the day's exercise results. They have no idea the world is sliding toward nuclear war. This is the story of Able Archer 83, the NATO exercise that nearly ended civilization. By 1983, the Cold War has turned hot again. President Ronald Reagan calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. In March, he announces the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile shield the Soviets feared could neutralize their nuclear deterrent. Former KGB chief Yuri Andropov now leads the USSR. He's deeply suspicious of American intentions. In 1981, he launched Operation Ryan, nuclear missile attack. As he warned his officers, the main objective of our intelligence service is to not miss the military preparations of the enemy for a nuclear strike. Soviet agents worldwide are ordered to watch for any sign of Western preparations for war. They monitor everything. The schedules of Western leaders, lights burning late in government offices, even blood bank activity, believing sudden increases in blood reserves might signal preparations for war. Oleg Gordivsky, a KGB officer secretly working for the British, later describes Operation Ryan as a vicious spiral of intelligence gathering and evaluation. The paranoia reaches new heights in September. Soviet air defenses shoot down Korean Airlines Flight 007. All 269 people aboard are killed. Reagan calls it a massacre. The Kremlin suspects it was a US spy mission. Just weeks later, on September 26th, a Soviet early warning satellite signals an incoming US missile attack. Only the cool judgment of duty officer Stanislav Petrov, who correctly deems it a false alarm, averts a Soviet counter-launch. Both superpowers maintain thousands of nuclear warheads on high alert. The Pershing II missiles NATO plans to deploy to Europe have flight times as short as 6 minutes. Soviet planners fear a decapitating first strike with virtually no warning. The stage is set. All it needs is a spark. NATO calls it Able Archer 83. It's the culmination of their annual Autumn Forge exercises, this year involving 100,000 troops across Europe. But Able Archer is different. It's a command post exercise. Military commanders practice the complex steps of nuclear war from their headquarters. The exercise begins November 2nd. The scenario is meticulously crafted. Political unrest in Yugoslavia triggers Soviet intervention. Warsaw Pact forces invade Finland, Norway, and Greece. NATO struggles to halt the onslaught. The conflict escalates from conventional battles to chemical weapons, and finally, to the unthinkable. NATO's official historian later writes the exercise focused on the transition from conventional to nuclear operations. For 5 days, NATO command centers go through all the motions of nuclear war. But 1983's exercise has unprecedented features that set it apart. For the first time, top Western officials participate. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl communicate with exercise commanders during the nuclear release scenario. President Reagan himself is initially slated to play a role, though calls off his direct involvement at the last minute. NATO employs unique, never-before-used communications procedures. New nuclear weapons release authentication codes, special encrypted signals. To Soviet monitors, the unfamiliar message traffic between the US and Europe looks suspicious. Most alarming, Able Archer simulates the full progression of nuclear alert levels, step by step from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1, the highest state of nuclear alert. No previous NATO exercise has ever simulated DEFCON 1. KGB stations report NATO is going to operational readiness number 1. In their analysis, war is inevitable and may start at any moment. During the nuclear phase, some NATO officers even misspeak over the radio, referring to practice bomber sorties as nuclear strikes. Soviet intelligence has been repeatedly warned that a Western nuclear attack might be masked as a training exercise. Now they're seeing exactly that pattern. New procedures, high-level participation, progression to maximum alert. A US analysis later admits these variations did in fact match Soviet-defined indicators for possible preparations for Ryan. The Soviets don't see an exercise, they see preparations for nuclear war. Within days of Able Archer's start, Moscow receives ominous field reports. On November 8th, the anniversary week of the 1917 revolution, KGB headquarters sends its flash telegram. Soviet intelligence has concluded the adversary might be about to launch war. The response is swift. In East Germany and Poland, the Soviet 4th Air Army loads nuclear weapons. A dozen aircraft sit on 30-minute alert, ready to strike NATO targets. The 70 SS-20 missiles on high alert are the very weapons targeted against NATO bases in Europe. Soviet ballistic missile submarines take up launch positions under the Arctic ice. Select tank divisions and combat units improve their readiness. This is not an exercise, it's arguably the most dangerous nuclear alert since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The timing is especially unnerving. NATO's drill continues even during the Soviets' major November 7th holiday, something unlikely if it were merely routine. In Moscow, Andropov and his commanders weigh their options. If NATO is truly preparing a first strike, the USSR must consider preemptive action. The world stands one miscalculation away from nuclear war, and almost nobody knows it. Able Archer enters its final phase. NATO staff reach simulated DEFCON 1. Soviet reconnaissance reports this to Moscow as if genuine. But in Europe, US Air Force Intelligence Chief Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz notices odd Soviet behavior. Soviet units are reacting, but to what? He faces a critical decision. Should he raise NATO's actual alert level in response? Perutz chooses to wait. He later admits it was based on instinct, not certainty. A US intelligence board will call it a fortuitous, if ill-informed judgment that helped avert disaster. Had NATO matched the Soviet alerts step for step, the Kremlin might have interpreted that as confirmation of their worst fears. The crisis could have spiraled beyond control. On November 11th, Able Archer concludes. NATO declares the exercise ended. As Western participants pack up, they remain unaware of the drama on the Soviet side. Seeing NATO stand down, Soviet forces quietly return to normal status. The immediate danger passes as suddenly as it arose. American commanders on the ground perceive no acute tension. The exercise sounded no alarm bells in the United States' indications and warning system. It's only much later the West will understand the truth. The Soviets genuinely thought nuclear war was imminent. One man helps uncover what really happened. Oleg Gordivsky, the KGB officer secretly working for British intelligence. In November 1983, he's stationed in London, privy to KGB communications about the war scare. He sees firsthand how alarmed Moscow Center is during Able Archer. He feeds critical warnings to MI6 about the Soviet panic. British intelligence pieces together that something highly unusual has occurred. When a US intelligence officer dismisses the war scare as a deceptive Soviet exercise, Gordivsky knows better. The Americans believe the Soviets are crying wolf. They found no hard evidence of anything extraordinary. But Sir Robert Armstrong's briefing to Thatcher concludes that the Soviet reaction was most likely genuine. The alert happened over a Soviet holiday. It involved real military units in the exact geographic area of the NATO exercise. All indicators of genuine defensive panic. Thatcher is alarmed. She orders British officials to urgently approach the Americans. She wants to ensure this can never happen again. When President Reagan learns of the Soviet war scare, he's stunned. The revelation profoundly affects Reagan. He's shocked that Soviet leaders truly thought America might launch a nuclear strike. In his November 1983 diary, he writes, "The Soviets are so paranoid about being attacked that we ought to tell them no one here has any intention of doing that." This scare prompts quiet but momentous change. NATO adjusts exercise protocols. No future war game will simulate DEFCON 1 without clear notifications. Channels open to assure Moscow during exercises, this is a drill, not cover for attack. Reagan, once skeptical of negotiations, becomes keen to eliminate the weapons that spooked the Soviets most. When Gorbachev signals willingness, they pursue what becomes the INF Treaty. Signed in December 1987, it eliminates all Pershing II and SS-20 missiles, a direct answer to the anxieties of 1983. For a few days in 1983, civilization balanced on a knife's edge. Not because anyone wanted war, but because fear and misunderstanding nearly made it inevitable. The nuclear weapons are still there. The early warning systems, the command centers, the plans for retaliation. All it takes is one misunderstood exercise, one misread signal, one leader convinced the other side is about to strike. We came that close once. The only question is, when will it happen again?